And in the public gallery, we have St. Francis Secondary School, Subukia, Nakuru County. On your behalf and on my own behalf, I welcome the students and their teachers to the House of Parliament. Now, honorable members, I see the screen is full. I believe you have logged in on this. Julius Melly, majority, you want to be the first to go? Okay.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And Honorable Speaker, I rise to support and allow me, Honorable Speaker, to first begin by
remember, those who are contributing to this in a procedural motion on limitation of debate, time is 5 minutes for each and every contributor, including the majority leader.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. And I hope the clerk has noted you took about 30 seconds of the 5 minutes. Honorable Speaker, I was thanking the chair of the committee and members of the committee, led by Honorable Makali Mulu, who is a very diligent member of this committee and the chair. Honorable Speaker, I rise to support this report. And many of the recommendations, Honorable Speaker, especially regarding our fiscal consolidation process, from the 3.9 that is envisaged in the next financial year 24-25 to the 3.3 in the medium term, the 2 years following the next financial year, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, as we speak about fiscal consolidation, the fiscal consolidation program, Honorable Speaker, will encompass two aspects of it, both revenue generation, and that I'm sure the Finance Committee will later in the year be bringing the Finance Bill 2025 that will deal with matters to do with revenue generation. But more importantly, Honorable Speaker, is on expenditure and how we are able to rationalize our expenditure as a country. And this is where we've had a huge challenge. And if you listen to what the Honorable Makali Mulu was saying, the media changes usually emanate from reviews of our expenditure, Honorable Speaker, where every supplementary budget comes with additional expenditure at the time when revenues are also not growing, but revenues are going down. And I do hope, Honorable Speaker, that the National Treasury this time round will adhere to what the committee and the House is recommending should we adopt this report as it is and the recommendations of the committee as they are. That, Honorable Speaker, if the National Treasury discovers within the year that our revenues are either not performing or improving, then it is imperative that they also review the expenditure side of our budget, because that is a challenge we've had. And the Honorable Dindi Nyoro, our chair of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, I know has been very keen on this, but I want to ask him that this year we must actualize what we say as a House. That because the National Treasury, and indeed not the National Treasury, I heard somebody say the other day that even our counties have borrowed from their big brother in the national government. We are seeing county government also doing budgets based on projected revenues that are never realizable. In my own county, Honorable Speaker, half year, I think we are at 1 point something billion shillings against a projection of 8 billion shillings, 7.98 billion shillings. And it's impossible in the next half year or 4 or 5 months to the end of the financial year to achieve the revenue targets that they had. And the same happens, Honorable Speaker, for our national government. And therefore, it's imperative that the National Treasury, when they realize KRA is not up to speed in terms of the revenue that they had projected, they review expenditure downwards. Probably, Honorable Speaker, it is time, and the Budget and Appropriations Committee has food for thought on whether do we put an embargo on new expenditure. And I know this has been there, but we need to make sure that additional capital expenditure is checked. Honorable Speaker, the other thing that we must check is our current expenditure. Honorable Speaker, I am seeing in the newspapers advertisements for jobs every now and then in the public service, and many of them may not necessarily be replacements of people who have left the offices, Honorable Speaker. And this, at the end of the day, will lead to very huge recurrent expenditure that will negate the fiscal consolidation that we are trying to pursue. Honorable Speaker, as I conclude, let me say that the National Treasury, as I said, must ensure that fiscal consolidation is not just a term that exists in our books and in these reports, that it is something that they must actualize this time round, Honorable Speaker. And with that, I beg to support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to also contribute to this debate. Mr. Speaker, two things come to mind on this issue of our debt strategy. First, I think we must be very, very careful as members of parliament before we vote what exactly we are voting for. Because this is the beginning of the budget cycle, and if we are not clear about what is happening, we may just agree to things and later on we start complaining. So we must note as members, this is the beginning of the budget cycle, the debt strategy is part of it, and we must be careful what we vote for. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we also must be careful as politicians what we say, even when it is during campaign time. Because, Mr. Speaker, there are things that we have to do eventually, and sometimes it is very, very humiliating and humbling for people to eat humble pie. Because, Mr. Speaker, you note that when we passed the last finance bill, there are some parts of that finance bill that later on members who had accepted them went out there and started complaining publicly. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, when you look at this strategy, it actually, passing this enables and allows the government of Kenya Kwanza to borrow more. And you must remember the promises that were made during the campaign trail. We were told that borrowing, in fact, they demonized the previous head of state, and apparently borrowing was supposedly a very bad thing. And now we are continuing to borrow. We are planning to borrow. We are setting up ourselves to borrow some more money. Mr. Speaker, it is, in fact, I can say that this regime can teach a lot to the previous regime on borrowing, because they are now going further into using other marketing instruments like green and blue bonds, samurai bonds, panda bonds, sukuk bonds, among others. So basically, there is a better and more intention of borrowing from this strategy. But Mr. Speaker, borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing, because even in our own investments, we borrow so that we can do good things with that money. What matters is what exactly do you use the money for? Exactly how do you spend that money? If you borrow and put up an investment that returns, it gives you good returns, then it's a good investment. But Mr. Speaker, if you borrow and consume and use that money for normal day-to-day operations, then that becomes a problem. Mr. Speaker, it's also a problem, and this is what is happening. When you borrow to pay back loans, Mr. Speaker, it is not a good strategy to borrow so you can pay back loans. And unfortunately, I am seeing a tendency where the current borrowing is at a much higher cost than the previous borrowing. So you're borrowing so you can settle loans that were borrowed at lower interest rates, and you are paying higher interest rates based on the plan that is there now. Mr. Speaker, we have to be careful about these things. But Mr. Speaker, I also think it's unfortunate that there is a lot of borrowing from the local market. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the former president, the late President Kibaki did, is that he stopped borrowing from the local market. Mr. Speaker, immediately that happened, it opened up and stopped crowding out the private sector. So people with businesses were able to take loans from banks. In fact, before Kibaki, even opening accounts with some of these banks, some of these major banks, was almost impossible, because even the minimum deposits were so high, because they were dealing directly with the government. So, Mr. Speaker, it is actually something that we need to look at. Why allow ourselves, our government, to borrow from the local market and crowd out the private sector? Mr. Speaker, I also want to point out that Treasury, Mr. Speaker, is not taking this House seriously. And Mr. Speaker, you are aware that several times Treasury has told this House that they will release funds for GAF, for GCDF, and they didn't honor it, I think about 4 times. Mr. Speaker, I'm saying that because if you look at the policy resolutions, they actually confirm what I am saying. The policy resolution number 5 says that within 30 days of the adoption of this report and subject to Section 50 of the Public Finance Management Act, Treasury will submit a comprehensive report to the National Assembly on the breach of the debt anchor of 55% to GDP. Mr. Speaker, we are at about 70.8% to GDP. That means that when they gave an undertaking, they did not fulfill it. And now we are giving them time to go and fulfill something they didn't fulfill when they had the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, again, in the last discussions on this strategy, medium-term debt strategy, we talked about Treasury opening a single account. Mr. Speaker, we are repeating ourselves. 12 months.
Time is up. Joseph McClap is not there. Omboko Milemba? Yes. You are on intervention.
Oh, microphone. Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for this chance to speak on this medium-term debt management strategy. Basically, the medium-term debt management strategy and things to do with this were basically things of the IMF. And they were supposed to make the countries know how they will fix the deficits that are in their budgets. But I also believe greatly that this must be customized to different countries. In this case, it needs to be customized to Kenya so that it can work well for Kenya. In the report that we are having before us, Honorable Speaker, the deficit is likely to be above 703 billion Kenya shillings, which needs to be fixed. And this strategy helps us to see how we shall fix that deficit in the budget and which strategies that the Treasury will use to fix this deficit. And it becomes very important to discuss this and understand as a House, and thanks to the fact that it's coming earlier than the budget itself, unlike last year when the opposite happened. It's important, Honorable Speaker, that we understand that there are also things within the system itself in Kenya that are creating more higher debt for us and which can be fixed and which this report has actually covered. When you look in the report itself on its own recommendations, on recommendation number 5, it talks about the adoption of single account by the Treasury. This is one area, even though, Honorable Mbui, you stopped there and looked like you are getting tired because we said this last year, we are saying it again, we have to continue saying this so that we hammer it until it's accepted that there's need for a single account at the Treasury. Because how often, Honorable Speaker, are we borrowing money when we have our own money in different banks, which is our own money? We realized during the committee sittings that there were very many case studies where the government has money or has borrowed money, and that money is deposited in banks. It stays there for more than even 5 years, and those banks still lend to the government in form of treasury bonds and treasury bills, such that the government of Kenya then ends up borrowing its own money, which it borrowed from outside at a higher interest rate, has given to a department or a ministry in this country. That money goes to a bank, and then it's again lent to the government as local borrowing in form of treasury bonds and treasury bills. So it is making our borrowing even escalate for no proper reason. And therefore the need to create a single account by the Treasury, this cannot be left out. Even if we repeated it last year, we have to hammer it down so that it is done. Another case study, Honorable Speaker, which is making our borrowing to escalate are the cases of commitment fees on loans and the timelines for dispersing the loans. We also saw within the committee sittings that so many loans have been given to Kenya by several institutions, but the Treasury has not utilized those loans. Somewhat, the country still pays something called commitment fees on these loans, and these commitment fees continues to be paid year in, year out, despite the fact we have not used those loans, and that escalates our borrowing, which is not good. So I would be asking that as we go into this session, we go slow on committing ourselves to taking loans, which we are not ready to use them. As the time goes, as I conclude, I should also speak on the issue of the various loans which are with us, we have taken, but unfortunately we are not using them, and therefore they end up being expensive. Like the earlier speakers said, as we do borrow, sometimes we end up borrowing loans that are more expensive to pay cheaper loans, and that is dangerous for the deficits that we have in our budget. With those few remarks, I want to support.
The Honourable Member for Baringo North, Honourable Joseph Makilap.
They are engaging. Madam Speaker, thank you for this opportunity. I rise to support this report of my committee. Madam Speaker, public debt has become a stigma for our country, which we need to be able to have controls so that we are able to finance programs of this country without struggling to pay debts. Madam Speaker, one thing that we've realized as a committee, which some members have raised, is that there are a lot of money that are pending in various international banks that has been paid as commitment fee to the tune of about 4 billion shillings for loans that we have not received or used. Madam Speaker, you know, you are aware that the BFM Act is very clear that we borrow for development. And if you borrow for development, what is it expected? It's expected that you borrow, inject